Ethan Carter had always believed in the sanctity of a place called home. A decorated military veteran turned dedicated city official, Ethan now spent his days balancing civic responsibility with a passion for restoring classic cars, a hobby that transformed his modest suburban garage into a personal sanctuary of chrome and nostalgia. His home, nestled on a quiet tree-lined street, wasn't just a structure of brick and mortar. It was the culmination of years of hard work, sacrifice, and the promise of a peaceful retreat after a life of service. Every detail of Ethan's property spoke to his values. From the meticulously maintained garden to the lovingly restored vintage sedan parked in the garage, his surroundings radiated pride and personal expression. The house's wide, welcoming porch had served as a gathering spot for neighbors over countless summer evenings, and its warm light, carefully chosen to create an inviting ambience, had become a symbol of Ethan's commitment to community. But that night, as the clock edged toward dawn, that very light would spark a confrontation that threatened his haven. At precisely 5 a.m. on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday, a sharp rap at his front door jolted Ethan awake. Bleary-eyed yet instinctively alert, he padded to the door and cracked it open. Standing there, framed by the pale light of early morning, was Karen, a figure who had become infamous in the neighborhood. Dressed in a crisp blazer with a clipboard clutched in one hand, Karen's expression was a blend of entitlement and stern authority. Known among residents as the self-appointed enforcer of every HOA regulation, she carried herself as though the community's well-being depended solely on her unwavering vigilance. "Ethan Carter," Karen began, her tone clipped and commanding, "I'm here because my son needs access to your property keys. It appears you've been neglecting the guidelines set forth by our HOA." Her eyes narrowed, as if expecting immediate submission. "Your porch lights, by the way, are in violation of our aesthetic standards. Too bright, too disruptive. This is your final warning." For a moment, Ethan was taken aback. The absurdity of the request, handing over his personal keys at an ungodly hour, sent a ripple of disbelief through him. "My property keys," he echoed, incredulity mingling with the remnants of sleep. "Karen, I never agreed to relinquish control of my own garage. And as for the lights, they're meant to welcome friends and neighbors, not to cause mischief." Karen's face contorted into a mask of haughty disapproval. "The rules apply to every homeowner, Ethan. You must abide by them," she said firmly, her voice rising slightly as she emphasized each word. "This isn't a personal vendetta. It's about maintaining order and uniformity in our community." Even in the early hours, Ethan could sense the familiar storm of entitlement that often accompanied Karen's visits. Over the past few months, whispers among the neighbors had painted a damning picture of an HOA board that operated less as a democratically elected body and more as a clique of self-important individuals. Karen, as the de facto leader, had been known to levy fines on a whim, enforce arbitrary standards, and even issue threats that bordered on intimidation. Tonight, as she stood at his door with that clipboard and a demand that defied reason, Ethan felt both the sting of injustice and the burning resolve to stand his ground. He took a steadying breath and stepped back, closing the door just enough to peer at her unwavering gaze. "Look, Karen," he said evenly, "I appreciate the idea of community standards, but there's a limit. My home is my sanctuary, and those keys are the only thing keeping my personal space secure. I'm not going to allow an overreaching board member to dictate who enters my home." The tension between them crackled in the cool dawn air. Karen's eyes flashed with indignation as she retorted, "It's not just about your keys, Ethan. It's about setting an example. If you won't comply, then you're undermining the very foundation of our community's order." In that charged moment, Ethan realized that this wasn't merely a dispute about keys or lights. It was emblematic of a larger struggle against an organization that had overstepped its bounds. Here was a woman who, by her very title as HOA president, had twisted rules to suit her personal agenda. While Karen's rigid adherence to the rules was meant to enforce uniformity, it also smothered the individuality and freedom that Ethan had fought hard to secure. A part of him wanted to dismiss the encounter as a trivial misunderstanding, but another part, the part that had once served his country with honor, recognize the importance of defending personal rights. Karen, if you think I'm going to just hand over my keys at 5 a.m. because of some arbitrary regulation, you've got another thing coming, Ethan said, his voice now steady and resolute. I intend to review every clause of these so-called guidelines, and if they're not legally binding, I won't hesitate to take this matter further. For a brief moment, silence fell between them, an uneasy pause where the morning's stillness battled with a rising storm of conflict. The first rays of the sun began to peek over the horizon, illuminating the determination in Ethan's eyes and the barely concealed smugness in Karen's. This was a spark that would ignite a broader confrontation, a clash of wills between a man who cherished his hard-won autonomy and a self-styled guardian of conformity. As Karen's lips pressed into a thin line and she prepared to retort, the quiet neighborhood around them bore witness to the beginning of a struggle that promised to upend the very fabric of community living. In that single charged moment, the battle lines were drawn, and neither party was willing to back down. The harsh light of early morning barely pierced the lingering fog when Ethan Carter's day took an unexpected turn. As he stepped out onto his porch for his routine cup of coffee, his eyes were immediately drawn to an envelope hastily taped to his front door. Its embossed HOA logo glinted in the weak dawn, and an unsettling chill ran down his spine as he recognized the implications of the message contained within. Inside the envelope, formal language conveyed a chilling verdict: a $750 fine for violating community light regulations. The notice detailed in stiff legal jargon that his carefully chosen porch lights, designed to foster a welcoming atmosphere, were deemed disruptive and non-compliant with the neighborhood's aesthetic standards. Ethan's brow furrowed as he reread the document. There had been no prior warning, no discussion of potential discrepancies, only an unyielding demand for immediate rectification. And at the bottom of the notice, in bold and unapologetic typeface, was Karen's name, her signature mark of authority and entitlement. Barely had Ethan absorbed the shock of the fine when he heard measured footsteps approaching his front yard. Peering through a gap in the drawn curtains, he saw Karen standing on his manicured lawn. Clad in a crisp blazer and armed with an unyielding expression, she surveyed the scene like a commander overseeing a minor but pivotal skirmish. With arms crossed and a clipboard in hand, she appeared every bit the self-appointed guardian of community order. "Ethan," Karen began, her tone carrying a mix of condescension and righteous indignation, "these rules aren't suggestions. They're mandates for the good of the community. Your refusal to adhere is not only a violation of our standards, but a direct challenge to the order we uphold." Her eyes sparkled with a smug certainty that she had already won this battle. Ethan's response was measured but firm. "I understand the importance of community standards, Karen, but there's no legal basis for a fine over something as innocuous as my porch lights. I've reviewed the regulations, and I find no evidence that my lighting falls outside acceptable norms." His voice, steady and resolute, reflected a man who wasn't about to let arbitrary power go unchecked. Not willing to accept his protest, Karen's tone grew sterner. "If you continue to defy these established guidelines, Ethan, the consequences will extend beyond a mere fine. The HOA has the authority, and we will exercise it fully to enforce compliance, even if that means involving local authorities." Her words, laced with a veiled threat, hung in the air as the morning grew increasingly tense. Determined to safeguard his rights, Ethan quickly retrieved his phone and began dialing the local zoning office. Before he could even articulate his concerns, his ears caught the murmur of additional voices outside. Within minutes, several inspectors, dressed in the standard uniform of municipal oversight, began arriving at his property. Their sudden appearance, summoned by a flurry of anonymous complaints, suggested that Karen was pulling every string available to enforce her will. Standing in the midst of this unanticipated inspection, Ethan maintained his calm. He greeted the inspectors with a courteous firmness, presenting them with the official fine and his personal documentation of the HOA's claims. "I'm happy to cooperate with a proper review," he stated, "but I must insist that all actions taken are based on actual violations and not on unfounded assertions." His words, laced with the authority of both his professional experience and personal conviction, were met with uncertain glances from the inspectors, who appeared torn between following protocol and acknowledging the clear discrepancies in the claims. Karen's face hardened further as she stepped forward, aligning herself with one of the inspectors. "You see, Ethan, these regulations are in place for a reason. If you refuse to comply, it sends a dangerous message to the rest of the community." Her voice resonated with a self-assured finality that was meant to stifle any further debate. Yet the mounting evidence in Ethan's favor, confirmed later by the zoning office's official response, began to cast doubt on her assertions. By early afternoon, the situation had escalated into a public spectacle. Neighbors peered from behind drawn curtains as the standoff unfolded on Ethan's front lawn. While Karen's threats of further penalties and legal action were meant to intimidate, they only fueled Ethan's resolve. In a calm yet defiant tone, he declared, "I will not be bullied into submission by rules that aren't legally binding. I am prepared to take every necessary step to protect my home and my rights." Determined not to let this challenge pass without consequence, Ethan meticulously documented every detail: snapshots of the fine, recordings of the heated exchanges, and notes on the actions of the inspectors. This record, he knew, would be crucial should the battle escalate further. As dusk settled over the troubled neighborhood, Ethan retreated inside with a newfound determination. The day had confirmed his suspicions. The HOA, under Karen's leadership, was not interested in fair governance, but in asserting control by any means necessary. And while the initial power move had rattled him, it had also ignited a fire of resistance, a commitment to stand up against overreach and to defend the sanctity of his personal space. In that long, turbulent day, every threat and every unjust fine only served to reinforce Ethan's belief that his fight was not solely for his own rights, but for the fundamental principle that no community, no matter how well-intentioned, should have the power to trample individual liberties under the guise of order. Ethan awoke one crisp morning to find his once peaceful existence shrouded in a new wave of intimidation. The previous day's fine and Karen's stern warning still echoed in his mind, but nothing could have prepared him for the audacity of the HOA's next move. As he sipped his coffee, a neatly folded letter arrived by mail, not just any letter, but one that carried with it the unmistakable weight of manufactured violations. The document cited multiple infractions, ranging from unauthorized exterior modifications to vague structural irregularities, accusations that Ethan knew were baseless. What was even more alarming was the foreboding threat that, should he fail to remedy these non-existent issues within an impossibly short deadline, the HOA would take drastic measures, including eviction and the seizure of his property. Determined to understand how his simple love for a well-lit, welcoming home had turned into a battleground, Ethan began a discreet investigation into the HOA's actions. Over the next few days, he reached out to several neighbors, and the whispered conversations revealed a troubling pattern. Many residents recounted similar experiences: sudden fines, arbitrary inspections, and baseless allegations. One longtime neighbor, Marcia, confided in hushed tones, "They're not just enforcing rules, they're creating them on the fly, and Karen is at the center of it all." Her words resonated with Ethan, confirming his growing suspicion that the HOA was no longer about community welfare, but rather about consolidating power through fear and intimidation. Fueled by a mix of righteous anger and the resolve honed by years of service, Ethan began combing through public records, meeting minutes, and financial statements. His investigation soon unveiled irregularities that went far beyond minor mismanagement. Several documents hinted at a disturbing misuse of HOA funds. Money that was meant for community improvements was being funneled into accounts that, curiously, appeared to be under Karen's direct control. Every fabricated violation notice and every punitive measure seemed designed less to uphold a standard and more to serve a personal vendetta. During one evening at a local diner, Ethan found himself in quiet conversation with Mr. Harris, a soft-spoken board member whose unease was palpable. "I've seen things that don't add up," Mr. Harris admitted, leaning in so that others could not overhear. "Karen's been pushing these so-called rules, even when the evidence isn't there. It's like she's playing judge, jury, and executioner. This confession, delivered in a low, earnest tone, provided Ethan with the validation he needed. It wasn't just his own property that was being unfairly targeted. It was a systematic abuse of power affecting the entire neighborhood. Karen's tactics only grew more brazen as the conflict escalated. In a move that bordered on theatrical, she orchestrated a series of surprise inspections at residents' homes. Although these raids were cloaked in the language of community welfare and safety, their timing and nature made it clear that they were designed to unsettle and coerce. Ethan's own home became the focal point of this campaign of intimidation when Karen ordered an emergency inspection of his modest shed, alleging concerns over its structural integrity. Independent contractors later confirmed that the shed was not only structurally sound, but also in full compliance with local codes. Yet the damage was done. The inspection left Ethan with a lingering sense of violation and the undeniable truth that the HOA was acting with impunity. Matters came to a head at the next HOA meeting, a gathering that had evolved into little more than a staged arena for Karen's authoritarian displays. With the room packed with anxious homeowners and wary board members, Ethan stepped forward, armed with the mounting evidence of corruption. He laid out his meticulously gathered dossier, copies of the fabricated violation notices, bank statements hinting at misappropriated funds, and testimonials from concerned residents. The silence that fell over the room was heavy, punctuated only by the shifting of uneasy feet. Some board members exchanged glances of doubt, their confidence in Karen's rule beginning to waver. Yet Karen, undeterred, dismissed Ethan's revelations with a wave of her hand. "These are nothing more than selective accusations from disgruntled homeowners," she sneered, her voice rising to assert dominance. "I assure you, every measure we've taken is for the greater good of our community." Despite her bravado, the seeds of discontent had been sown. The residents, now armed with undeniable proof of arbitrary enforcement and mismanagement, began to murmur their support for Ethan, a lone voice of reason challenging an increasingly oppressive system. That night, as Ethan bolted the door against the chill, he couldn't shake the gravity of the escalating conflict. This was no longer a simple dispute over porch lights or property keys. It had evolved into a battle for the very soul of the neighborhood, a struggle to reclaim a community once based on mutual respect and fairness from the clutches of authoritarian overreach. Every fabricated violation and every threat of eviction further steeled his resolve. In the quiet darkness of his living room, surrounded by the tangible evidence of injustice, Ethan vowed to continue his fight, not just for himself, but for every neighbor who had been silenced by Karen's unyielding grip on power. As the conflict deepened and the true extent of the HOA's corruption came to light, Ethan prepared himself for the next stage of the battle, a counterattack that promised to expose the rot at the heart of the organization and restore the balance between individual rights and community order. The morning light revealed a scene straight out of a nightmare. Ethan Carter stumbled from his bedroom, expecting the familiar comfort of home, only to be met with the sound of heavy machinery tearing at the edge of his driveway. Outside, a backhoe was already at work, churning up the gravel and concrete of his cherished entrance. In the distance, Karen's voice cut through the clamor, crisp and unyielding. "This is for the greater good of our community. Expanding sidewalks to improve safety." Ethan's heart pounded as he rushed outside, his eyes scanning the chaos. "Expanding sidewalks," he muttered, incredulous. The driveway had been his personal haven for years, a place where he parked his vintage car and welcomed neighbors with a smile. Now, without warning, it was being dismantled, as if it were nothing more than an obstacle to Karen's vision of a perfect, regulated neighborhood. Determined not to let this blatant overreach stand, Ethan quickly retreated inside. His mind raced through the documents he had meticulously compiled over the past weeks, proof of arbitrary fines, records of fabricated violations, and testimonies from equally dismayed neighbors. Today, these papers would be his shield and sword. By late morning, the local community center buzzed with murmurs of discontent. Homeowners, previously too intimidated to speak out, gathered for an emergency HOA meeting. The air was thick with tension as Karen, resplendent in her signature blazer and clipboard, took the stage. With practiced authority, she declared, "Today, we enforce community progress. The measures we've taken, including necessary alterations to private property, are all in the service of collective betterment." Before Karen could continue, the doors burst open. Ethan strode in, a file thick, with legal documents under one arm and determination blazing in his eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice firm and unwavering, "I stand before you not as a defiant homeowner, but as someone who believes in the rule of law and our right to protect our property." He paused, scanning the room. Faces that had once been shadowed by fear now looked up, curious and emboldened. Ethan opened his file and began laying out the evidence. "These documents," he explained, holding up a stack of official correspondences and zoning records, "prove that the HOA has no legal authority to seize or alter private property without due process. Karen's orders to dismantle my driveway were not only unlawful, they're a violation of my fundamental rights as a homeowner." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room. Neighbors exchanged knowing glances, many nodding in silent approval. Karen's face flushed as she struggled to regain control of the situation. "This is merely a misunderstanding," she insisted, her voice tremulous with a hint of panic. "The changes are for our safety, and they're approved by—" She was cut off by a sharp interjection from one of the board members, who admitted quietly, "I never saw any proper authorization for these measures." The meeting atmosphere shifted palpably. Ethan's calm, evidence-backed presentation had not only exposed the overreach, but had also sowed the seeds of dissent among the board and the homeowners alike. One neighbor, Ms. Rodriguez, spoke up with a quiver in her voice. "My house has never been subjected to such invasive measures before. We deserve a proper explanation and respect for our property rights." Her words resonated deeply with the crowd. Emboldened by the growing support, Ethan pressed on. "I have contacted local authorities and filed a formal complaint regarding the unauthorized alterations. This is not an isolated incident. It's a systematic abuse of power by an HOA that claims to serve us. I urge you all to review the rules, understand your rights, and stand against these tyrannical measures." His declaration was met with a rising chorus of nods and murmurs of agreement. As the meeting continued, more homeowners stepped forward with their own accounts of unfair treatment, stories of sudden fines, unwarranted inspections, and even threats of eviction. The collective voice of the community grew louder, a unified demand for justice and accountability. Karen's earlier confidence began to crumble as she fumbled for a response, her arguments falling apart under the weight of irrefutable evidence and communal anger. Outside the meeting hall, the rumble of city authorities could be heard. Word had spread quickly, and local inspectors were arriving to assess the legality of the HOA's actions. Ethan received a text from a fellow homeowner. "Officials are on the way. Karen's gone too far this time." The message only fueled his resolve. Inside, as Karen attempted to salvage her authority with feeble reassurances, Ethan calmly outlined the next steps. "We will be taking this matter to court if necessary. We will have the records, the testimonies, and the legal backing to protect our homes. Today is not the end. It's the beginning of a new era for our community, where our voices matter." His words, both a rallying cry and a promise, echoed through the room and resonated with every homeowner present. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that the balance of power had shifted. Karen's tactics, once seen as unassailable, had now been exposed as overreaching and oppressive. With the community united behind him, Ethan's counterattack had struck a decisive blow. The day's events marked a turning point. No longer would the homeowners cower under the weight of arbitrary rules and unchecked authority. Instead, they were ready to reclaim their rights, their privacy, and their home. As the meeting adjourned and the crowd dispersed, Ethan stood quietly by the entrance, watching neighbors leave with a newfound sense of empowerment. The sound of construction in the distance was still a stark reminder of the battle waging outside his doorstep, but it was now tempered by the hope of change, a change that promised to restore dignity and fairness to the community. As the tension in the neighborhood reached a fever pitch, Karen's tactics grew increasingly reckless. With her authority already slipping away, she resolved to try one final, audacious move, one that would force the community's hand and salvage her dwindling control over the HOA. One cool evening, as dusk was settling over the quiet streets, Karen picked up her phone and dialed the local police station. In a tone laced with urgency, she reported a public disturbance emanating from Ethan's property. According to her fabricated account, the bright glow of Ethan's carefully curated porch lights was disturbing the peace and provoking unruly behavior. Within minutes, the wail of sirens pierced the evening calm as 2 patrol cars pulled up in front of Ethan's home. Inside, Ethan was unwinding with a rare moment of relaxation when the commotion roused him from his reverie. He quickly donned his city official badge, a symbol of his civic duty and personal integrity, and stepped outside to meet the arriving officers. As the police approached, Karen was already on the scene, her expression a mix of determination and barely concealed desperation. "Officers, I must insist that you take immediate action," Karen declared, her voice trembling with a mix of authority and anxiety. "This disturbance is a blatant violation of community standards. These lights are not only intrusive, they are creating a public nuisance." Ethan met the officer's eyes with calm resolve. "Officers, everything is perfectly legal and in full compliance with local ordinances," he explained evenly, displaying his badge as a symbol of his official capacity. The officers exchanged glances, their initial deference to Karen giving way to a careful review of the situation. After a brief discussion and a check of the relevant codes, it became clear that Ethan's property did not constitute any public disturbance at all. Frustration etched deep into Karen's features as she realized her ploy had failed. But she wasn't finished yet. Determined to undermine Ethan by any means necessary, Karen secretly enlisted the help of a private investigator, a shadowy figure known for his willingness to skirt legal boundaries in search of scandal. His assignment was simple: dig up any dirt on Ethan, however trivial, that could be used to discredit him in the eyes of the community and the board. Unbeknownst to Karen, Ethan had grown increasingly savvy. Over the past few weeks, he had fortified his property with discreet security cameras, an insurance policy against the HOA's unpredictable maneuvers. Late one night, while reviewing the footage from his garage, Ethan noticed something out of the ordinary. In a dark corner of his property, the camera had captured a figure lurking near the back door, a person whose movements were furtive and clearly surreptitious. Zooming in, Ethan recognized the unmistakable shape of the private investigator hired by Karen. The footage was damning. The investigator was seen scaling a low fence and slipping into the garage, rifling through boxes and taking photographs of personal documents and cherished mementos. Ethan's blood ran cold as he realized the extent of Karen's desperation. She was willing to stoop to illegal trespassing to tarnish his reputation. Armed with the incriminating evidence, Ethan prepared for his next move. At the following HOA meeting, a room already buzzing with discontent and whispered doubts about Karen's leadership, Ethan arrived with an air of quiet determination. The room fell into a hush as he stepped forward and plugged his laptop into the projector. With a click, the grainy but unmistakable footage filled the screen. A murmur rippled through the assembled homeowners and board members as they watched the footage. The private investigator's unauthorized entry, caught unambiguously on camera, left little room for doubt. Karen's face, already flushed from her earlier confrontation, went pale as the reality of her actions was laid bare for all to see. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ethan's voice rang out clearly, "what you are witnessing is not an act of concern for community standards. It's an outright violation of my privacy and the law. This footage shows an individual trespassing on my property, and I have every reason to believe that he was sent here by none other than our HOA's own Karen." The room erupted into a mixture of shock, anger, and disbelief. Questions flew fast and furious. Many board members, now emboldened by the overwhelming evidence, demanded explanations and accountability. Karen fumbled for words, her earlier bravado completely eroded by the undeniable proof of her underhanded tactics. In that moment, it became painfully clear that Karen's final desperate gambit had backfired. Not only had her attempt to manufacture a public disturbance been exposed as a baseless lie, but her covert efforts to dig up dirt on a dedicated community member had also been laid bare for all to see. The HOA board, once her staunch supporters, now regarded her with a mix of disappointment and indignation. With the room still abuzz, Ethan concluded his presentation. "I believe this footage speaks for itself. It's time we restore the integrity of our community and hold those who abuse their power accountable. Today, justice begins with transparency and respect for each homeowner's rights." As the meeting drew to a close, it was evident that Karen's days as the tyrannical enforcer were numbered. The community's trust had been shattered, and her overreaching actions had sealed her fate. With every exposed lie and every illegal act captured on camera, Ethan had not only defended his own rights, but had also ignited a turning point for the entire neighborhood, a point where accountability and fairness would finally triumph over entitlement and abuse of power. In the charged silence that followed, Karen slinked away, her authority in ruins, while Ethan stood at the forefront of a community reborn in defiance of injustice. In the days following the explosive HOA meeting, the tide of public opinion surged in favor of Ethan and the beleaguered homeowners. What had once been a community under the iron grip of Karen's arbitrary rule was now buzzing with quiet determination and hope. Rumors of impending change spread like wildfire as neighbors, energized by the undeniable evidence of misconduct, gathered in doorways and over backyard fences to discuss the future of their neighborhood. At the next scheduled board meeting, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. The room, once filled with the anxious deference of those intimidated by Karen's authority, now pulsed with the united resolve of a community ready to reclaim its rights. Several board members who had long harbored doubts about Karen's leadership now wore expressions of resolute defiance. It was clear that a reckoning was at hand. Karen entered the room with her usual air of misplaced confidence, clutching a folder of documents as if they could shield her from a storm. But the moment she stepped into the meeting hall, the murmurs of discontent and pointed looks from her fellow board members made it evident that her influence was rapidly evaporating. One by one, residents recounted their experiences, unjust fines, unauthorized inspections, and the illegal actions that had rocked the foundation of the HOA. Their voices, once stifled by fear, now resonated with clarity and purpose. Taking center stage, Ethan addressed the assembly. "Today," he began, "we stand at a crossroads. We have seen how unchecked power and arbitrary decisions have undermined our community. The evidence is undeniable. Our HOA has been corrupted by practices that betray the trust of every homeowner here." He paused, letting his words sink in. It is time for accountability, and that accountability begins with leadership changes. Before Karen could muster a response, a motion was put forward by a board member whose tone left no room for negotiation, a formal vote of no confidence in Karen's leadership. The motion, backed by the overwhelming majority of homeowners present, was swiftly and decisively passed. In that moment, Karen's power crumbled in front of everyone. The vote wasn't just symbolic. It was a declaration that her era of unchecked authority was over. The repercussions were swift and multifaceted. News of the board's decision soon reached local authorities, prompting an investigation into the HOA's practices. Within a week, city officials confirmed that many of the measures enforced by Karen and her cronies were not only baseless, but in clear violation of municipal regulations. The investigation culminated in a substantial fine levied against the HOA, money that in part would be used to reimburse the wronged homeowners and fund community projects aimed at restoring trust. But Karen's downfall wasn't limited to the boardroom. The very public humiliation of her ouster was compounded when, on her way out of the meeting, a flurry of neighbors surrounded her with pointed questions and bitter recollections of past transgressions. Some residents, emboldened by their newfound courage, shared their own stories of overreach and neglect. With every retelling, Karen's credibility diminished further, until it was impossible for anyone to ignore the legacy of entitlement and abuse that she had left in her wake. In the ensuing days, the community rallied around Ethan, who had become an emblem of resistance against tyranny. Homeowners organized town hall meetings and neighborhood forums, discussing not only the injustices of the past, but also the vision for a future where fairness and transparency would prevail. The new board, reconstituted with elected representatives who truly reflected the community's interests, immediately set about dismantling the remnants of Karen's regime. Policies were rewritten, fines rescinded, and a renewed emphasis was placed on inclusivity and respect for individual property rights. For Ethan, the victory was deeply personal yet served a broader purpose. Standing on his once troubled porch, now bathed in the soft, inviting light that had sparked so much conflict, he reflected on the long road that had led to this moment. The journey had been fraught with challenges, but it had also ignited a collective spirit of empowerment among his neighbors. His diligent efforts, from documenting every misstep to bravely confronting the abuses of power, had sown the seeds for a healthier, more just community. In a final act of poetic justice, the day came when the HOA's official website was updated to reflect the sweeping changes. Karen's name was removed from all official documents, and a public notice detailed the steps being taken to ensure that such overreach would never happen again. As the new policies were celebrated at a community barbecue held on Ethan's front lawn, a sense of renewal permeated the air. Neighbors laughed, shared stories of the past, and looked forward to a future defined not by authoritarian mandates, but by mutual respect and collective well-being. In that moment, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan couldn't help but smile. The downfall of Karen and the collapse of her misguided authority had restored something precious, a community where each person's voice mattered, and where the sanctity of one's home was finally protected from the whims of the few. In the wake of Karen's public humiliation and the community's uprising, the full weight of legal scrutiny finally began to crush the remnants of the corrupt HOA. The dramatic boardroom revolt was only the beginning. As whispers of abuse spread beyond the neighborhood, local authorities and legal experts took notice, setting in motion a cascade of consequences that would bring the organization to its knees. City officials, prompted by numerous complaints and bolstered by the undeniable evidence that Ethan had meticulously gathered, launched a comprehensive investigation into the HOA's practices. It soon emerged that the board had been enforcing non-existent rules, imposing arbitrary fines, and engaging in unauthorized property alterations, all without the legal authority to do so. Within days, the city levied a substantial fine against the HOA, a penalty that underscored the gravity of its violations. This fine was not merely punitive. It served as a stark reminder that even quasi-private organizations were not above the law. Meanwhile, Ethan, who had become the de facto champion for his fellow homeowners, mobilized the community for a class action lawsuit against the HOA. Neighbors, emboldened by their recent victory, joined forces under Ethan's leadership to demand restitution for the financial and emotional toll exacted by the HOA's relentless overreach. The lawsuit detailed every instance of abuse, from baseless fines and illegal property alterations to the blatant misuse of community funds. As legal papers were served and courtroom dates set, it became clear that this was a fight that would redefine community governance. Not all board members escaped the legal fallout. Several individuals who had once supported Karen now found themselves under the microscope. Their complicity in the HOA's unlawful practices led to criminal charges ranging from fraud to official misconduct. The investigation uncovered that funds meant for community enhancements had been siphoned off to cover personal expenses and even, in some cases, funneled directly into Karen's own accounts. These revelations prompted further legal actions, with some board members facing penalties that could include restitution and even jail time. In a final twist of poetic justice, Karen herself was not left unscathed. Desperate to salvage her reputation, she attempted to blame her actions on ambiguous interpretations of the HOA's guidelines. However, the mounting evidence was irrefutable. Even her personal lawyer, once a trusted advisor, came under investigation after it was discovered that he had been complicit in drafting the dubious regulations. The state bar soon opened an inquiry into his conduct, adding another layer of accountability to the unraveling scandal. As the legal proceedings moved forward, the courtroom became the stage for Ethan's final power move. With the support of a seasoned legal team, he presented an airtight case that not only detailed the illegal actions of the HOA, but also demonstrated how these actions had infringed upon the basic rights of every homeowner. The public record, replete with documented violations and witness testimonies, painted a damning picture of an organization that had operated with unchecked power. By the time the verdicts began to roll in, the HOA's authority had been completely dismantled. The organization faced not only crippling financial penalties, but also an irrevocable loss of trust among the community. What had once been seen as a guardian of neighborhood standards was now exposed as an institution of abuse, a stark lesson that no one was immune from the long arm of the law. In the end, as the community began to rebuild on the foundation of transparency and fairness, Ethan's relentless pursuit of justice had ensured that the abuses of the past would never be repeated. The legal collapse of the HOA was not just a victory for him. It was a triumph for every homeowner who had suffered under the shadow of entitlement and corruption. In the wake of Karen's public humiliation and the community's uprising, the full weight of legal scrutiny finally began to crush the remnants of the corrupt HOA. The dramatic boardroom revolt was only the beginning. As whispers of abuse spread beyond the neighborhood, local authorities and legal experts took notice, setting in motion a cascade of consequences that would bring the organization to its knees. City officials, prompted by numerous complaints and bolstered by the undeniable evidence that Ethan had meticulously gathered, launched a comprehensive investigation into the HOA's practices. It soon emerged that the board had been enforcing non-existent rules, imposing arbitrary fines, and engaging in unauthorized property alterations, all without the legal authority to do so. Within days, the city levied a substantial fine against the HOA, a penalty that underscored the gravity of its violations. This fine was not merely punitive. It served as a stark reminder that even quasi-private organizations were not above the law. Meanwhile, Ethan, who had become the de facto champion for his fellow homeowners, mobilized the community for a class action lawsuit against the HOA. Neighbors, emboldened by their recent victory, joined forces under Ethan's leadership to demand restitution for the financial and emotional toll exacted by the HOA's relentless overreach. The lawsuit detailed every instance of abuse, from baseless fines and illegal property alterations to the blatant misuse of community funds. As legal papers were served and courtroom dates set, it became clear that this was a fight that would redefine community governance. Not all board members escaped the legal fallout. Several individuals who had once supported Karen now found themselves under the microscope. Their complicity in the HOA's unlawful practices led to criminal charges ranging from fraud to official misconduct. The investigation uncovered that funds meant for community enhancements had been siphoned off to cover personal expenses and even, in some cases, funneled directly into Karen's own accounts. These revelations prompted further legal actions, with some board members facing penalties that could include restitution and even jail time. In a final twist of poetic justice, Karen herself was not left unscathed. Desperate to salvage her reputation, she attempted to blame her actions on ambiguous interpretations of the HOA's guidelines. However, the mounting evidence was irrefutable. Even her personal lawyer, once a trusted advisor, came under investigation after it was discovered that he had been complicit in drafting the dubious regulations. The state bar soon opened an inquiry into his conduct, adding another layer of accountability to the unraveling scandal. As the legal proceedings moved forward, the courtroom became the stage for Ethan's final power move. With the support of a seasoned legal team, he presented an airtight case that not only detailed the illegal actions of the HOA, but also demonstrated how these actions had infringed upon the basic rights of every homeowner. The public record, replete with documented violations and witness testimonies, painted a damning picture of an organization that had operated with unchecked power. By the time the verdicts began to roll in, the HOA's authority had been completely dismantled. The organization faced not only crippling financial penalties, but also an irrevocable loss of trust among the community. What had once been seen as a guardian of neighborhood standards was now exposed as an institution of abuse, a stark lesson that no one was immune from the long arm of the law. In the end, as the community began to rebuild on the foundation of transparency and fairness, Ethan's relentless pursuit of justice had ensured that the abuses of the past would never be repeated. The legal collapse of the HOA was not just a victory for him. It was a triumph for every homeowner who had suffered under the shadow of entitlement and corruption. Karen's final unraveling was as public as it was personal. Once hailed as the unchallenged enforcer of HOA regulations, the mighty Karen now found herself besieged by the very consequences of her actions. The community's outcry and the relentless legal proceedings had exposed her overreach, and as her professional authority crumbled, so too did her personal life. In the weeks following the legal verdicts against the HOA, Karen's world began to fracture. Her husband, once her steadfast ally in maintaining a veneer of control, could no longer stomach the public humiliation and the mounting evidence of corruption. Their once carefully curated life started to disintegrate. Quiet conversations turned into bitter arguments, and ultimately, the divorce papers arrived unceremoniously on a dreary afternoon. The end of their marriage was a painful emblem of the downfall of the woman who had prided herself on perfection and unyielding authority. Public humiliation continued to mount. The luxurious car that had once been Karen's chariot, a symbol of her self-imposed status, was soon repossessed. Creditors and legal authorities, determined to extract accountability, swept in, and the very vehicle that had once been paraded as a trophy in the HOA's parking lot was towed away. Neighbors watched in muted satisfaction as the spectacle unfolded, their whispered comments carrying the bitter taste of justice served. At City Hall, where Karen had often boasted of her indispensable role in maintaining order, she now found herself a pariah. Officials and community members alike remembered her aggressive tactics and her cavalier disregard for individual rights. Each attempt she made to salvage her reputation with convoluted defenses of the HOA's bylaws was met with skeptical looks and curt dismissals. Her presence in these meetings, once commanding and authoritative, was reduced to awkward interludes where she struggled to speak over the murmurs of disapproval. The most ironic twist came when Karen, blacklisted by nearly every respectable HOA board for her notorious reputation, accepted a job as an assistant property manager in a neighboring community. The role was a far cry from the self-appointed queen of her former domain, a humbling demotion that was both ironic and bitterly satisfying. One quiet Tuesday, as Ethan strolled through a local hardware store, he unexpectedly caught sight of Karen, dressed in a modest uniform and attempting, with evident discomfort, to blend in with the ordinary staff. She was a far cry from the formidable figure she once projected. Their eyes met briefly, a silent acknowledgement of the dramatic reversal of fortunes. In that fleeting moment, Ethan couldn't help but allow a small, knowing smile to cross his face. It was poetic justice incarnate. The very person who had so zealously enforced arbitrary rules now found herself at the mercy of the system she once manipulated. Neighbors who recognized her whispered among themselves, a mixture of disbelief and dark humor underscoring the transformation. As news of her new employment spread through the community, the story of Karen's downfall became a cautionary tale. The once powerful enforcer had become an example of how unchecked entitlement inevitably leads to ruin. No longer did she carry the aura of authority. Instead, she was forced to abide by the very regulations she had once twisted for her own benefit. In the quiet aftermath of her personal and professional collapse, Karen was left to confront a stark new reality, a life stripped of its former glory and filled with a humbling lesson that true power lies not in dictating the lives of others, but in upholding fairness and accountability. For Ethan and his neighbors, Karen's fall was a resounding affirmation that justice, when pursued collectively, can restore dignity to an entire community.